In October 1966, the U.S. military didn't draft the strong. They drafted the vulnerable. While America's privileged elite hid behind pristine college deferments, military recruiters were secretly filling out entrance exams for men who couldn't even read, write, or tie their own combat boots. The goal? To systematically harvest over 350,000 fragile minds and send them into the deadliest jungles on Earth as de facto human shields. They called it Project 100,000. History calls it McNamara's Folly. Welcome to the modern ledger. The crisis began deep within the cold, calculating heart of the mid-1960s American military apparatus. The conflict in Southeast Asia was expanding at an unsustainable pace, consuming human lives faster than the traditional draft could replenish them. Unwilling to pay the immense political price of mobilizing the National Guard or drafting the politically connected middle class, the administration faced an existential dilemma. The army needed bodies, and they needed them immediately. The demand for frontline infantrymen was soaring, but the supply of socially acceptable recruits had run completely dry. To cross that divide, policymakers did not look to compromise or withdrawal. Instead, they looked to the margins of society. Enter Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. Raised on the strict doctrines of corporate efficiency, systems analysis, and industrial optimization, McNamara viewed the world through the pristine, unforgiving clarity of spreadsheets. Before running the Pentagon, he had revolutionized the assembly lines of the Ford Motor Company, treating every mechanical component as an interchangeable part. To him, human beings were merely quantifiable inputs in a grand machine of warfare. If the military was running out of qualified men, his solution was chillingly simple. You do not alter the geopolitical strategy of the war. You simply lower the standards of who qualifies as a soldier. If the pool of eligible recruits is too small, you widen the net until the bottom of the barrel is completely scraped clean. Under the glittering public relations guise of the war on poverty, Project 100,000 was set into motion. The Pentagon boldly proclaimed that the military would act as a great leveling agent, rescuing the forgotten youth of America's urban slums and rural hollows by teaching them discipline, literacy, and modern trade skills. It was painted in the national media as a program of profound social elevation, a compassionate hand up for the disadvantaged. But behind closed doors, it was a cold, bureaucratic calculation to feed a grinding combat machine. The minimum armed forces qualification test scores were drastically lowered, creating an inescapable bureaucratic dragnet designed specifically to catch the very people who had no capacity to comprehend the trap. Among those swept up by this automated system were men who possessed cognitive developmental levels equivalent to young children. Some could not count to 10. Others could not identify basic colors or understand simple spatial directions. Alongside them were individuals with severe physical limitations, painful joint deformities, curvature of the spine, partial blindness, and developmental delays, conditions that would have triggered an automatic medical disqualification just months prior. Yet, driven by aggressive quotas, the enlistment databases processed them all, issued them green fatigues, and shipped them toward the training camps. The system had decided that human flesh was an interchangeable commodity, ignoring the fundamental reality that to survive a war, a soldier must first possess the capacity to understand the commands that keep him alive. The arrival of these recruits at bases like Fort Benning and Fort Bragg triggered a state of quiet horror among seasoned drill instructors. Veteran soldiers, accustomed to forging capable citizens into disciplined combatants, suddenly faced an impossible, heart-wrenching mission. They stared at recruits who would weep in confusion over basic physical tasks, men who could not distinguish left from right, and individuals utterly incapable of grasping the intricate, life-saving steps required to clean and clear a jammed rifle. The training grounds, designed to build combat readiness, became arenas of sheer bewilderment and despair. In the high-stress, screaming environment of basic training, these new standards men fell into a terrifying cycle of isolation and fear. They were constantly punished for failing to execute orders they fundamentally could not comprehend. Recognizing the sheer cruelty of the situation and the active danger it posed to everyone in the field, many drill instructors attempted to fail these recruits during final evaluations, hoping to keep them safely stateside in non-combat labor battalions where they might survive the war. But the relentless machinery of Washington tolerated no deviations from the quota. The system demanded its raw material, and it demanded it on schedule. When instructors intentionally failed these men to save their lives, unseen hands in the Pentagon quietly intervened. Test scores were altered in back rooms. Failing grades were wiped clean by top-secret decrees. The system demanded raw material, and it didn't care if that material could read. Terrified, incompetent recruits were rubber-stamped for combat. The perfection of the spreadsheet superseded the value of human life. The files were marked compliant, and the men were sent to the front lines. By 1967, the massive waves of these compromised recruits hit the dense, suffocating heat of the Vietnamese jungle. The transition from quiet rural poverty or isolated city blocks to the hyper-stimulated, invisible warfare of Southeast Asia was an immediate, shattering trauma. In a landscape where survival depended on reading precise map coordinates, translating complex radio frequencies, and identifying almost invisible booby traps, the new standards men were tragically lost. The field reports from this era are grim. Many could not read the warning labels on their own equipment or the instructional diagrams on military-issue gear. They struggled to set the direction of claymore mines, sometimes pointing the lethal blast inward toward their own defensive perimeters instead of outward toward the enemy. During silent night patrols, unable to comprehend complex hand signals or the nuance of tactical maneuvers, panic would set in. In the absolute chaos of a sudden ambush, those functioning at a slower cognitive pace were simply paralyzed by sensory overload, unable to process the screaming, the explosions, and the shifting directions of enemy fire. This tragedy placed an immense, crushing psychological burden on the regular soldiers serving alongside them. In combat, survival is built on absolute mutual trust. Every man is a vital link in the chain. When top-down mandates deliberately weakened that chain, the survivability of the entire unit plummeted. Seasoned squad leaders were suddenly forced into the agonizing role of full-time caretakers in an active war zone, responsible not only for fighting the enemy, but for keeping grown men who functioned like children from accidentally killing themselves or others. Knowing a single mistake could wipe out the entire squad, leaders made brutal, desperate decisions. They assigned the new standards men to the least complex yet most hazardous duties, carrying heavy ammunition crates through deep swamps or walking point down booby-trapped trails. It was a brutal triage of human lives, forced upon young field commanders by bureaucrats sitting safely in air-conditioned offices thousands of miles away. The vulnerable were placed in the path of greatest danger because the system had no other place for them. As the years ground on, the statistical reality of Project 100,000 bled through the mounting casualty lists. Long after the helicopters stopped flying, analytical reviews uncovered a devastating truth. The casualty rates for these low-standard recruits were up to 3 times higher than those of typical soldiers. They were disproportionately represented among the dead and wounded, falling victim to easily avoidable traps, navigation errors, and friendly fire incidents. The grand political promise of social elevation had dissolved into the blood-soaked mud of the Mekong Delta. Yet, back in the quiet corridors of the Pentagon, the project was hailed as a triumph of statistical management. To the architects of the program, the silent desperation unfolding in the tropical rainforests was entirely invisible, neatly reduced to acceptable percentages on weekly progress reports. The program ground on relentlessly until 1971, when the accumulation of battlefield failures and the shifting tide of public opinion forced its unceremonious termination. By then, over 354,000 men had been fed into the flames of conflict. For the survivors, the end of the program was merely the beginning of a new nightmare. Because of their cognitive or physical difficulties, a massive number of them struggled to adapt to the rigid post-war military life, resulting in discharges under conditions other than honorable. This bureaucratic label was the final, devastating betrayal. It stripped them of veteran benefits, denying them access to the crucial mental health care, educational programs, and housing assistance needed to rebuild their shattered lives. Instead of being lifted out of poverty, they returned to their old neighborhoods, bearing profound, invisible scars. Abandoned by the government that had used them to balance a political ledger, many slipped quietly into homelessness and deep obscurity, their sacrifices unacknowledged by a nation determined to look away. They became ghosts in the very land they had been forced to defend, forgotten by the system that had drafted them. Today, Project 100,000 remains one of the most deeply unsettling chapters in modern history. It serves as a stark warning of what happens when human lives are treated as abstract data points, and social engineering is weaponized to solve a political crisis. Project 100,000 wasn't a glitch in the machine. It was the machine working exactly as designed. They traded the lives of America's most vulnerable to shield the privileged class from the draft. So I'm asking you, was McNamara's Folly just a dark, isolated chapter of the 1960s? Or are systems today still calculating the acceptable losses of the working class? Drop your raw thoughts in the comments below. Subscribe to The Modern Ledger to keep unearthing the history they tried to bury. Question everything.